The winds of change blew through Africa and Asia in the late 20th century as countries throughout the world were supposedly breaking their chains and becoming independent. At least that's what was supposed to happen, but many feel that the former colonial possessions are still in the process of decolonization. For instance, it was only a year ago when France's former West and Central African colonies promised to throw away their currency for the newly created one called the ECO. The currency in the process of being phased out is the CFA franc, and it's seen as a legacy of French colonialism in West and Central Africa. Many have accused France of using the currency to maintain an influence in their former colonies. This is because the CFA franc was full of rules that African countries had to follow. France's former African colonies had to keep 50% of their foreign exchange reserves within the French treasury, and the currency was tied to the euro, which meant that the African countries had very little control over their own money. The circumstances that these French-speaking countries find themselves in are by no means unique. Throughout the developing world, former colonies still have unequal relationships with their former colonial masters. Many have thrown around the word neocolonialism to describe these relationships, but what is it and why is it relevant? Neocolonialism can be described as developed countries controlling less developed countries through indirect means. Powerful countries will seek to exploit weaker countries like they did with the colonies of the past, but instead of using military power, they'll use the global economic system and their own economic supremacy to do so. In a neocolonial state, a country will have political independence, but ultimately be too dependent on richer countries for economic and political issues, so the neocolonial masters will indirectly control the state through that dependence. This is different from traditional colonialism because colonial masters used their military might to directly control their colonies politically and economically. Neocolonialism as a concept was influenced by thinkers like Karl Marx, who wrote about the evils of capitalism's ever-growing influence. But it was French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre who is credited with first using the term in his 1964 book, Colonialism and Neo-Colonialism. In his book, Sartre criticized France's control over its ex-colonies and advocated for the end of France's influence on them, especially in Algeria, which had just achieved independence after a major war against its former colonial master. In 1965, neocolonialism would become more commonly used after Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, wrote his book called Neo-Colonialism: The Last Stage of Imperialism. The book would introduce the term into African political philosophy and begin its use in the overall discussion of decolonization around the world. Many have written about neocolonialism in practice since then. Argentine economist Raul Prebisch proposed dependence theory. While it is not exactly the same as neocolonialism, many have used dependency theory to describe how neocolonialism works in practice. According to the theory, underdevelopment is caused by the position of developing countries in the world economy. Many developing countries tend to be in the peripheral or the edge of the global economy, while developed countries like the United States are in the center. Underdeveloped countries are only able to offer cheap labor and raw materials on the world market, and these are sold to developed countries which are industrialized, so they have the ability to turn those raw resources into finished products. Underdeveloped countries like Nigeria or Bangladesh, who don't have the capacity to make their own products, will find themselves being the ones that buy the finished goods made by developed countries. These products tend to be sold at high prices, which ultimately means developing countries spend their money on buying goods rather than investing in their industry so they can produce finished goods themselves. The result of this is a cycle in the world economy that keeps stark divisions between rich core economies and poor peripheral economies. Neocolonialism manifests in different ways as well. Multinational organizations are corporations that operate in many different countries. Many corporations tend to be active in poor countries because they have untapped resources that can be used to make a profit. Some would see the rise of companies like these and think they'll improve the developing country because they'll bring money and jobs to the area. This doesn't tend to be what happens though. Many of these corporations bring benefits back to their home economies abroad rather than to the local ones. Leaders of developing countries will let corporations do this because they'll use the opportunity to enrich themselves. The political leaders tend not to be committed to their national development and will collaborate with neocolonialists so they can benefit from their country's exploitation as well. Financial aid and loans tend to be another way that neocolonialism can display itself. International organizations such as the World Bank tend to be dominated by Western nations and will use its global influence to give aid to developing countries. More often than not though, the aid will come with conditions. These conditions are used to indirectly control the economic policies of the country receiving aid. Loans will work the same way. Developing countries often fall into debt from loans and need relief to prevent themselves from drowning in it. Loan relief will be another way that more powerful countries can exert influence on weaker countries' political and economic economic policy. Neo-colonialism in a lot of ways mirrors traditional colonialism. Both result in the exploitation of people within a weaker state. Many thought that colonialism and its ills were gone the moment former colonies gained their independence. But like everything else in life, it's not that simple. While there has been progress since African and Asian countries gained their political independence, there's still a lot of work to be done to achieve total independence. France's former African colonies, for example, may be discarding their currency for a new one, but the eco will still be tied to the euro, which means that European countries will still have an unequal amount of control over the currency for a large part of Africa. These aren't the only issues either. Countries like China have been accused of luring developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa into debt traps, which leads many to accuse the country of having neo-colonialist ambitions. Overall, neocolonialism is a real issue within many countries that's not talked about nearly as much as it should be. Developing countries need to address the issue and do so effectively if they truly want to be more than just tools to enrich more powerful countries.